Thank you much, Matt, for that gracious introduction. I'd ask all of you to lower your expectations. What an honor it is to be with all of you. I feel humbled to be in your presence, proud to be a Jesuit and connected to your enterprise and our enterprise. At Homeboy, the homies aren't that, really connected to the whole Jesuit thing, really. They don't really know what it is that much, And I remember once I was sitting in my office having a meeting with some homies, and my office is glass enclosed, and we have tour groups all the time, including a lot of immersion groups from your schools. And there was a homie named Gilbert who has kind of a loud-ass voice, and he's giving the tour, and he's standing in front of my office. It's one of those, observe our founder in his natural habitat. And he very loudly says, "This is Father Greg Boyle, the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest." So I gave him my best. I felt I had to deliver. So there's a kind of vision that brings you to Chicago and to this gathering. And it's a vision of not just, jiu-jitsu education. It's really about wanting the world to look differently than it currently looks, especially now in the times in which we live. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we find our way to standing against forgetting that? How do we imagine with God a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? We know that we're all invited to somehow in our way, in our own particularity, to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And to that end, as the Pope invites us, and certainly the universal apostolic preferences invite us to walk with the poor and the outcast, which is to say to go to the margins. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like and why would we even do it. And so we go to the margins and we stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. We go to the margins because it's the only way that the margins can ever get erased, is if we locate ourselves out at them. And we look under our feet and we see that in fact happens when we do this. And that we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And we stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And everyone in this room has had the experience, and even their students have had this experience, to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. We've been given this gift occasionally to be able to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And we get to stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. An image now seared into our mind is the image of this father and his daughter drowned on the shores of Brownsville. How do we stand with them and imagine them not outside the circle? And how do we stand with those, even with compassion and inclusion, with those who have set policies that made that moment happen? It's the challenge of the gospel. It is the marrow of the gospel. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. No matter how singularly focused we may well be on those worthy goals, they actually can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other. And there are no exclusions to that truth. And so to that end, what we seek to do is allow God's dream to come true, to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And I suspect if that happened to be our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice. We would be celebrating it. And so we invite our students and ourselves as the models to stand at the margins and we brace ourselves, because the world will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." In the end, it's about gladness. In the end, it's about voices singing. Or as Jesus would tell us, "My joy yours, your joy complete." And none of this makes a damn bit of sense unless we're anchored in the notion of God. And so when one of the Universal Apostolic Preferences talks about to show the way to God, it's important to know what kind of God we're talking about. I had a spiritual director years ago who said to me, "We need a better God than the one we have." He was a Jesuit. But of course he was right, because Ignatius always talks about the God who's always greater, and we've settled for a partial, puny, lesser God, more realistic God. I think there is nothing more consequential in our mission than to know what kind of God we actually have, and to catch ourselves when we settle for less. Meister Eckhart, a great mystic and theologian, said, "It is a lie, any talk of God that does not comfort you." But on some level, we don't believe that, because we think God has this whole other agenda, which issues in God's eternal disappointment in us. And yet, I think it's true. Every mystic knows this. It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort us. Find me a mystic who believes in hell, and you will have located a person who's not a mystic. Some of them would begrudgingly say, "Okay, hell exists, but it's empty." That's because these are mystics who know what kind of God we actually have. And there is nothing more consequential than that. But the homies have taught me just about everything of value, and I'll always be indebted to them, and they've expanded my vision of who God is in remarkable ways, so that you come to see this God who is spacious and expansive, the God we actually have. We know what this experience is like. We remember when Dylan Roof tragically killed all those folks in Mother Emanuel Church, but within a week's time, family members of the victims were standing in front of him and saying, "We forgive you," with a kind of spacious sense of what mental illness really looks like, and that demonizing is always the opposite of who God is, always. And you knew you were in the presence of the God we actually have. And then 9 months later, when he was sentenced to be executed, and people called it God's justice, you knew we had wandered back to the God we've settled for, the partial one, the lesser one, the puny one. The more realistic one. How do we locate ourselves to know this God who loves us without measure and without regret? A God who's not created in our own image, which is our tendency because we're human. My friend Annie Lamott always says, "You know you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do." But it's a temptation that you need to catch yourself. from falling into that temptation and trap. So the homies have always widened my way of seeing it, and they do it often by way of mangling the English language, which I always find more illuminating as well as delightful. There was a homegirl named Lisa, one of our homegirls in our 18-month training program, and at the end of the day, she wanted to introduce me to her man, and so she brings him in. He came to pick her up, and she says, "This is my sufficient other." And I said, "No doubt." You know, I have a CEO, Tom Wilson, who runs Homeboy, which is in the nick of time, you know, because it's a $20 million annual operation is quite large, and I'm happy not to have to worry about budgets and meeting people. I worry about it, I just don't, you know, he handles it. And so I had a homie come into my office early in the morning, one of our trainees, and he goes, "Damn, gee, my lady, she is in a bad mood today." And I said, "Why?" "Well, you know, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I just finished mine." I kind of know what she's going through. But my favorite one, more to the point of the point I'm trying to make, is that I was celebrating the Eucharist at San Fernando Juvenile Hall a number of years ago, and in those days, you know, we were in a gym with 500 kids, all gang members, male, mainly, maybe one row of females, and I invested my album, my stole, sitting on a folding chair on a little raised thing like this, and you know, I have this little sheet, and it has the readings in English and Spanish, and so the homies can follow along. And you do this when you preside. You go, "Well, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to listen to the word proclaimed." And the homies got up one by one. First guy got up and did the first reading. I'm listening to it. And the second guy gets up and he has kind of an overabundance of confidence in his voice, and he's doing the responsorial song. And he looks out at everybody and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I look at the sheet, what the hell? And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because if you think about it, the exalted God has to be a creation of God made in our own image, because there isn't anybody in this room or outside of it. If you were God, you would want to be exalted. Every knee shall bend and tongues wag. That's what you would want. But the exhausted God is a spacious notion. It's generous. It's a God who says, "Yeah, it's not about me. It's about you." Wow. That is a better God than the one we have. When we're called to see our God as a universal apostolic reference, nothing is more consequential than to see the God we actually have and catch ourselves when we settle for less. If I could speak personally, last year I buried my 92-year-old mama, who had 8 kids, and I had buried my father like 25 years ago, and she died in her own home, in her own bed, and she was sharp, even to the very last minute. In fact, in the last year of her life, she had watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying, you know. In fact, about a week before she died or so, she looked at me and she said, "I've never done this before." with glee, it was like, you know, something you might say before skydiving. In fact, the day before she died, her last words to me, and I happened to be alone there sitting next to her, she woke up and she saw me and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." Well, she was pissed off that she was still alive. Yeah, sorry. And as it was so fortunate the next day, actually, and this happened only twice, where I was the only one there, and my sisters had gone out. I had 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and I was sitting there alone, and she, at exactly noon, she opened her eyes, and she let out this tiny, wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And no one in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I tell you all that to tell you this, that in the last weeks of her life, every time she'd be in and out of consciousness, all my sibs, 2, 3, 4, all 8 of us around her bed, she would open her eyes and she'd lock onto one of us, and she'd say with breathless delight, "You're here, you're here." And after I buried her, I thought, well, I think that may well be the singular agenda item of the God we actually have. You're here. Even Jesus in the desert, we always kind of do this overlay and project stuff, dark night of the soul and growling stomach and eating locusts and doubt and oh my God and why did I give up both scotch and chocolate for Lent? And yet I suspect it was 40 days of Jesus just hearing God say, "You're here. You're here." It is a lie in talk of God that doesn't comfort us. Behold the one beholding you and smiling. And so you receive the tender glance of the God we actually have, and then you don't know what to do with it except to extend that tender glance into the world. Tender glance, that's it. And there is nothing more consequential in our lives and in our ministry than to know what kind of God we actually have. And so that leads you to want to go to the margins because you want to be there. You want to go there not to make a difference. So that's the thing we always say. How do we turn that on its head? If it's about you going to the margins to make a difference, then it's about you. I think we go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. And then you turn it on its head. There's a great many Buddhist sayings that begin with the sweet words, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." It's a way of saying to folks at the margins, "You're here." It's a way of being the tender glance at the margins, and that tender glance gets returned in this exquisite mutuality. We all begin at service, and all your kids begin at service, and obviously that's a good thing, but service is the hallway that leads to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of exquisite mutuality. Otherwise, there's distance, even in our service. Service provider, service recipient. You want to make sure that there is no daylight that separates us, where there is no us and them, there's just us. This is God's dream come true, that you shall be one. And that's the hope. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and he was absolutely the best listener I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to him, nobody else existed. He was laser beam focused. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if there was someone more important on the approach. It was his way of saying, "You're here, you're here." But quite famously, a reporter had commented to him once and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And he shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual," which is the hope. It's not about making a difference. It's about entering into that exquisite mutuality, which is God's dream come true, the God we actually have. But you want to bridge this distance. I remember I was in Houston, and after a talk I gave, a former gang member, now what we would call in the biz a hardcore gang intervention worker. He was working with gang members in the streets, and he came up to me and kind of pleaded with me, and he said, "How do you reach them?" Meaning gang members. And I found myself saying, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? Then suddenly you've turned something on its head. If you've sent your students out to reach the poor, then it has to be about them. But if you send them out to be reached, suddenly that's eternally replenishing. We don't believe in burnout at Homeboy Industries. We always tell each other, no, if you're burning out, if you're suffering compassion fatigue, then it's about you. Stop. But if it's about them, if it's about allowing yourself to be reached, then suddenly it's eternally delightful. It's endlessly replenishing. It's perfectly fine to be exhausted because our God is. But you can't be depleted, because if you are, it's about you. I just, a couple months ago, I was invited by the Archdiocese to speak at a thing called Theology on Tap, which apparently people come and have enough adult beverages to listen to me, so I don't really get it. But anyway, so afterwards, a young woman, a senior in the university here in the city, came up to me and she said, "I'm afraid to go to the marches." And I said, "Why?" She said, "I'm afraid I won't fit in." And again, like one of those frogs that leap out of your mouth, I grabbed her arm. I said, "If it's going to be about you, you'll always be afraid." And I felt bad that this frog had leapt out of my mouth, but it was too late. It already left. But I thought about it later. No, I think that's right. Our fear comes from our wanting to achieve and to be successful, and terrified of failure, and will I make a difference? No, stop. You want there to be no daylight that separates you, not service provider, service recipient. No homie found more job opportunities at Homeboy Industries than a guy we all called Dreamer. He grew up in Pico Gardens housing projects. I knew his older brothers, all from a gang. He got into a gang. One of the smartest kids I've ever known, though I don't recall he ever really actually went to school, but he was very smart and had a dangerous sense of humor, which I always appreciated. He's doing fine now in his early 40s, has a home, a good job, married, kids. But in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, kind of in and out of being locked up, and he would, come to my office, and I'd find him a job, maybe in the private sector or in one of our 9 social enterprises at Homeboy. Always within no time at all, he'd kind of gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he wandered back to me. And so it was a very frustrating, repetitious pattern that was getting old for me. So this one time he finished a 4-month stretch of probation violation at county jail, and there he is sitting in front of my desk, and he says what gang members often say: "This time, it'll be different." And I went, all right. So with him sitting there, I picked up the phone and I called a friend of mine named Gary, who ran a vending machine company in Alhambra, and he had hired homies in the past, so I'm hoping against hope maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, he said, "You tell that guy he can start tomorrow." That's a holding man right there. So Dreamer began work the next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again in front of my desk. I couldn't believe my eyeballs. I said, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again." But this time he reaches into his pocket and he waves his very first paycheck. And he says, "Damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proud. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well." "Who?" And he looked at me strangely and he said, "Well, God, of course." That would be God. You thought I was going to say you? I said, "No." God's number one. And he said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." I'm sorry, the Genesis days. He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now." Well, I guess he told me, but all I remember was the two of us, we literally fell out of our chairs. We were just howling with laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider, who's the service recipient. It's mutual. Our God, who loves us without measure and without regret, sets the thing up in the covenantal relationship and says, "As I have loved you." Now, the God we've created in our own image finishes the sentence. "As I have loved you, love me back." That's not what God says. God says, "As I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger." And God has identified these three subgroupings, if you will, of the poor, because God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks they happen to be our trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. And we thought it was the other way around. We thought we brought the message. We thought we made the difference. It's not passive. You don't just go to the margins to be reached and to receive, because that's where the power resides. That's where the joy can happen, only at the margins. We're not invited to the margins because it is the harder thing, but because it is the joyful thing. The first exhortation of Pope Francis was called the joy of the gospel. It wasn't called the thrill of being Catholic. It was about the marrow of the gospel. It was about taking seriously what Jesus took seriously. And fortunately for us, there are only 4 things. They're big things. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. If we take those things seriously, we are taking seriously what Jesus took seriously. And it is the marrow of the gospel, and it is where the joy is. There is no grim duty in that. As the poet William Carlos Williams says of poetry, if it ain't a pleasure, it ain't a poem. And the same is true of our living of the gospel. If it's not about joy, then we need to look again. It has to be about joy. My joy, yours, your joy complete. So Homeboy Industries was born a long time ago in 1988 when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission, nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. It's the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which is not typical of public housing, which led the LAPD to deem my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in Los Angeles. Los Angeles County has 120,000 gang members, 1,100 gangs. In 1988, I buried my first young person killed because of the sadness. And next week, I will bury my 228th, a young man named Kiko, who worked at Homeboy. And 2 weeks ago, he and another homie and I went to San Francisco to give a number of talks there. And he's left behind a daughter and a wife. So we did a lot of things in those early days. The first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high and middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. No one wanted them. And so they were in the middle of the day wreaking havoc and violent and selling drugs and writing on walls. So I walked out to them and I would kind of isolate them one at a time and I'd say, hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, every single one said, yeah, you know, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, you know, so that kind of forced my hand a little bit. So right across the street from our church is our parochial school, grade K to 8, that occupied the first 2 floors. Well, the entire 3rd floor was the convent. So I gathered all the nuns together in the living room and I sat them down. I said, hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And they looked at each other and they said, sure, which was the entirety of their discernment process. And so that brought gang members in large numbers to the church property, not to church services, which created something of a disconnect. So people in the parish would come up to me and say, yeah, you know, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? You know, good people in and bad people out, and which I thought was a good gospel challenge. And then the homies said, you know, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, and projects are mainly made up of women with children, not that many men actually. So the women in the parish and myself, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we just started things, you know, maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a graffiti removal crew, a crew to build our child care center on the property of the church, all made up of rival enemy gang members. So then in 1992, after the Rodney King verdict, the whole city kind of exploded and every pocket of poverty ignited, except the poorest pocket, Dolores Mission community. And so LA Times wanted to know why that was, and so they asked me, and I said, well, maybe it's because we had 60 strategically hired rivals, enemies, gang members, working side by side with each other. So they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. So the article appeared the next day. Well, the following day I got invited by a movie producer named Ray Stark to go to his office, and he happened to have $500 million. And he asked me, how do you think I should spend my money? And as I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request. I was young. So I said, well, there's a tore-up abandoned bakery across the street from the school. It's got ovens, they don't work. We could fix them. We could put, I don't know, hairnets on rival enemy gang members. They could bake bread. I don't know, we could call it Homeboy Bakery. That was the entirety of my business plan. And he said, sure. And so we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market in downtown LA. Once we had plural, we changed our original name, which was called Jobs for a Future, to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. Not everything worked, I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And now nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we have evolved. We have literally backed our way now into becoming the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on our planet. So 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors wanting to reimagine their lives. I suppose the first 15 years we were job-centric. We even had our motto, nothing stops a bullet like a job, on our t-shirts. And now in the last 15 years, fortunately, I think, we have embraced kind of a healing-centric approach. The principle being that an educated gang member or inmate may or may not go back to prison, and an employed one may or may not, but it is our contention that a healed gang member will not ever reoffend. That is, in fact, our guarantee. And so Homeboy is something of a sanctuary where folks who carry extraordinary chronic toxic stress can find some rest, because unless there's some respite, you can't deliver any services. And then they suddenly become the sanctuary that they found there. Then they go home and they provide that sanctuary to their kids, and for the first time they've broken a cycle. So the place is about tenderness, a community of tenderness that can hold people. It's quite foreign to gang members. Everyone who walks through the door comes with a 9 or 10 on the ACE study. If you've looked at that, I recommend a book called The Deepest Well. ACE study is adverse childhood experiences. Check-off list of 10: parent in prison, parent mentally ill, drugs, violence, abuse of every imaginable kind. I don't register a 1 on that list, which doesn't make me morally superior, quite the opposite. The day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than the folks who walk through our doors carrying things I've never been asked to carry. And so we have therapy and case management and navigators. We have like 50 different kinds of classes, anger management and parenting. If love is the answer, community is the context, but tenderness is the methodology. Otherwise, love stays in your head or in the air or even in your heart, but it doesn't become connective tissue unless it's tender. The great Jean Vanier, who recently died, said that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. And I think every mystic knows that that's correct. There's nothing that resembles the God we actually have than tender love. The free tattoo removal, no place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos. We have a designated clinic with 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant, 47 volunteer doctors. It was all started because you tried to listen at the margins. And it was started because of a guy named Frank who 2 days out of Corcoran State Prison, was sitting in front of my desk, and tattooed on his forehead like a big old black block letter billboard that said, "Fuck the world." And then Frank looked at me and said, "You know, I am having a hard time finding a job." And I said, "Frank, maybe we could put our heads together." So naturally, I hired him, and we bagged bread for a time, and then I went on the lookout for a doctor with a laser machine. I found one at White Memorial Hospital who gave me 1 hour a month to chip away at Frank's forehead and a handful of others. And in no time at all, I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted the same thing. So we couldn't really stay with that arrangement. Parentheses, Frank is currently a security guard at a movie studio in Hollywood, and there is no trace left of the angriest, dumbest thing he had ever done, proving once and for all, as Sister Helen Prejean tells us, everyone is a whole lot more than the worst things they've ever done. And then we have our 9 social enterprises, solar panel installation training, which is very successful. Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silkscreen, which has been around for like 26 years. Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff. Homeboy Diner, which is the only place you can get food at City Hall in Los Angeles. If you ever fly Terminal 4, American Airlines, we have a restaurant there. Farmers markets. We have a thing called Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips, salsas, and guacamole in all these grocery stores on both coasts. Stop and Shop, on the 5 states on the east, I guess. And we just got into 41 Walmarts on the West Coast. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude. And it's kind of a who's who. If you go there, you'll run into celebs and electeds, Jim Carrey, Forrest Whitaker, Jack Black. Once Vice President Joe Biden, when he was Vice President, came with 2 hours notice, Secret Service, motorcade, selfies with Joe. He was quite affectionate with the homies, which they didn't seem to mind. But most famously of all, Diane Keaton showed up, Oscar fame, Godfather movies, and Annie Hall, and her waitress is Glenda. Glenda's big girl, been there, done that, tattooed, felon, parolee, gang member. She has no idea who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, "Well, what do you recommend?" And Glenda rattles off 3 dishes that she particularly likes, and Diane Keaton says, "Well, I'll have that second one. That one sounds really good." And it's at that moment, for some reason, something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton. She says, "Wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. Like maybe we've met." And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. "Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before." And Glenda goes, "No, now I know. We were locked up together." Yeah, that just took my breath away. I can't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings. I think of it, but suddenly kinship so quickly. Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. That you shall be one. This is an exhausted God who doesn't want it to be about God. It's about us. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them? All of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused attentive love return people to themselves. What Martin Luther King says about church could well be said of your time here together at this colloquium. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to stand at the margins and to look people in the eyes and say, you're here, oh nobly born, remember who you really are. And the soul feels its worth, and everybody inhabits their own dignity. What the Dalai Lama calls Buddha nature. A reporter asked him to comment on the concept of self-hatred. And he didn't know what the reporter was asking, so he asked him to repeat it. He still didn't get it, and so he asked his translator, what does this mean, self-hatred? And the translator did his best. He says, I don't understand what you mean. All of us have Buddha nature, which is to say unshakable goodness. That's where we begin. That's the truth of who we are. And so you are enlightened witnesses who go out and just return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up. Instead, we want to hold the mirror up and tell people that truth. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. In fact, you are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And once somebody knows that truth, they become that truth, and no bullet can pierce it. For as troubled as Kiko was, and I've known him for 20 years, I think he knew that truth, that he was exactly what God had in mind, and no bullet can pierce it. No four prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it is huge. But at the margins, you have to reach in and you have to dismantle messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. The great Marcus Borg says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history in Scripture is shame and disgrace, and I think he's quite right. In the Acts of the Apostles, it has this one line that just leaps out at you, and it says simply, and awe came upon everyone. And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So some years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And it was what they call a gang-in service, so it's from 9 to 5 in a hotel ballroom. I've been to a lot of those. And they have workshops and keynotes. And I said yes, figuring I'd probably give a keynote, maybe at lunch or close the day or something. So I bought my ticket, and then I pulled the original invitating letter out a week before I was to fly, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker 9 to 5 all damn day. And as the homies say, I said, oh hell no. So I invited two trainees in, Andre and Jose. And it's an 18-month training program, so they were like in their 9th month or something. And I sat them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose got up first in front of these 600 social workers. And he's 25 years old at the time, and we had different phases at Homeboy, and so at that phase, he was kind of attached to the substance abuse team, and was quite a valuable member, a man solid in his own recovery. Now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So been to prison, tattooed, gang member, but he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of these social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so well. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worse in Spanish. I've never seen this happen. We got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. But then he continued, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California. And she walks me up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door. And a man comes to the door and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. And my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our service lies not in our compassion for those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And I suspect that it is that temptation that best describes the state we happen to be in our country. If we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. It's urgent that we go to the margins. And it is consequential to know the God who invites us there. Because the widow, orphan, and the stranger, they happen to be our trustworthy guides. They'll get us to where we need to go. Let me wind this down. I remember once I was interviewed by a nice Christian lady on the Christian Broadcast Network. And she asked me, what do we do at Homeboy? And I did kind of a similar litany as I did with you, from tattoo removal to training. to a community of tenderness that receives people, to a place where rival enemy gang members can work side by side with each other. Because the principle is you cannot demonize people you know, and demonizing is the opposite of the God we actually have. I went on and on for some length. And when I finished my list, she kind of made a face and she said, yeah, but how much time do you spend each day at Homeboy Industries, you know, praising God? And I didn't know what to say. So I said, all damn day. And I don't think she liked that answer. But it begs this question: what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? So it occurs to universities in particular to force their students on occasion to read my books against their will. I'm not complaining, but a number of years ago, my alma mater, Gonzaga University, forced their incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart, and they said, would you come and speak? And they had promised a huge venue, like 1,000 people. I said, sure. And they said, could you bring 2 homies with you? And I always do if people are going to pay for it. And I always pick homies in the same way among our trainees. I always pick enemies, rivals, just to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. It was a number of years ago. I had 2 older vatos at LAX airport. We were flying to DC, I think, and one of them, dead serious, said to me, hey, G, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yeah, actually, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I've done this almost 1,000 times, I suspect, with men and women, and I never picked, well, I picked 2 guys, Bobby, an African-American gang member from the bakery, and Mario, who worked at the time in our merchandise store. And for as many times as I've done this, I've never had anybody quite like Mario. He was absolutely petrified to the bone for flying. And I've always had nervous flyers, but never was starting to freak me out a little bit. And he in fact was hyperventilating, you know. And we hadn't even, boarded the plane. So we were at Burbank Airport, and for those of you who haven't flown there, it's kind of a small airport, big bay windows, big planes, Southwest mainly, but they don't have that hermetically sealed chute. To board the plane, you have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb the stairs to go to the front of the plane and the stairs to the back of the plane, which is the big feature at Burbank. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and Bobby's off walking somewhere in the airport, and our plane arrives. It's early morning, and they're deplaning. Everybody's getting off the plane. And I turned to Mario and I said, that's going to be our plane. And I think, wow, he may actually die before we ever get to those stairs. So then I see our flight crew arrives, and again, it's early morning, and 2 flight attendants, females, both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the stairs. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that in our 31-year history as an organization, nobody has ever has more tattoos than this guy Mario, which is really, trust me, saying something. And he's all sleeved out, covered in tattoos, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks chin eyelids that say the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody, I guess. And so I'm trying to calm him down and walk him through the airport, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting, because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and walk up to anybody and say, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? They won't say me. They'll think for half a second and they'll say, Mario. Yeah, Mario. He works in the cafe now. Mario is proof that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. Mario is proof that tenderness is our God. Tender glance, tender glance. So we get to Gonzaga, and this happens a lot. They have the big talk Tuesday night. They don't tell you that there are 93 other talks that are going to happen before that talk. And this class, this meeting, this lunch, this class, all damn day. And so I tell Mario and Bobby, I said, look, I'm not going to speak in any of them. I'll be in the back of the classroom. You get up and tell your stories. And they're nervous, especially Mario, but the stories, they do a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So at the evening talk, I get them up before me. They each do 7 minutes, a snapshot, so I can include them in the Q&A session. So they get up and do a good job, though Mario was quite terrified. And I get up and do my thing, and then I invite them to stand on either side so we can field questions. Yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario is a tall, skinny drink of water, and he clutches the microphone. He's just terrified. Yes. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter, and they're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone. I can sense he's starting to tremble, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with what the hell he's going to say. But suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears. But he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hand, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And let there be no doubt that everyone standing had been returned to themselves. And everybody saying to each other, "O nobly born, remember who you really are. You're here." The homies know what it's like to be watched. They don't know what it's like to be seen. Everybody's seeing each other. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. And so we go to the margins unafraid, because it's not about us. And we go to the margins, not to make a difference, but so that the widow, orphan, stranger, Jose, Mario make us different. We go to the margins to be in the world who our God is, tender, compassionate, and loving, and kind. We do not settle for purity. We hold out for holiness. We do not settle for a partial God. We hold out for the one we actually have. And pretty soon we cease to care as we go to the margins. If people accuse us of wasting our time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.